In addition to variables that we set in the instance itself, and we don't really call those variables, we call them attributes. Person name is an attribute of the instance. You can think of it as a variable within the instance, but it's really called an attribute. In addition to this, we have another type of attribute that we can make use of in our classes, and that is called the class attribute or class variable. I'll give you an instance, or an example rather, of the class attribute. I will say cvar equals 1000. Now you can see, if you look inside class and you just consider those lines of class, you can see that we basically have three variables defined. We have an integer variable, we have a method or function variable, and we have another method or function variable. Three of them defined within my class. All three of these are something that we call class attribute. It's a little strange in the sense that it's both an attribute and a variable. I mean, when you look at this, you can see that we've defined three variables, but they're not just regular variables, because if they were regular variables, they would either be inside a function or they might be out in the main body of the program, like we have it with x and zz. No, these variables are very different. They have been defined within the class, and because of this, they belong to the class. They are specific to the class. We can't, for example, print cvar out here. No one's going to know what we're talking about. cvar is defined inside the class, so it may seem very similar to the idea of a local variable from a function, but it's really actually different. When we define a variable within a class, we're actually defining an attribute of the class. I'll show you that I can access this class variable or this class attribute as an attribute of the class. This class variable can be accessed as an attribute of the class. That's what we're seeing here at the end. So this starts to create functionality that might seem similar to other functionality we've looked at. So this is where we need to try to keep things as straight as possible. The attributes that we looked at earlier were attributes that we were setting in the instance. And so we can call these instance attributes, object attributes, attributes of the instance. But the class also has attributes. Those attributes are defined in the class as variables, but they're accessible in the class through the class's attributes. This is another bit of magic that we have to begin to get straight in our thinking. We call these class attributes or class variables. They are available through the class and through its attributes. But here's where it gets particularly, or potentially I should say, confusing. You can also access class attributes through the instance. I'm working with the string. That was a mistake. Let's do it with x. There we go. You can also access these class attributes through the instance. Now, why is that the case? We're still not going to talk about it just yet. I'm going to make my input a little, I'm going to make my output a little more explicit, so I'm going to make sure I wasn't running an earlier version of the program or something, but there it is. Through the instance 1000, okay. So how is it that we can access class variables or class attributes through the instance? It's a little bit of magic, a little bit more of magic, because we've seen a fair amount of magic in these videos. It's a little bit of magic that gives us access through the instance. And I want you to reflect on the fact that when I say x.greet, Python needs to know where to look. x.greet, yeah, it's a method, and we've understood that when you call a method through the instance, it will call the method in the class, but it's a little more basic than that. When we say instance.attribute, we're looking up a value that we then find in the class. The class attribute can be looked up through the instance. We saw that it can also be looked up through the class, but most commonly we'll be accessing class variables or class attributes through the instance. Now, obviously, we've gone over a lot of magic functionality, and not all of it is necessarily, you're not able to connect it together with what we're going to do with it. We still haven't seen that yet. These videos are really just going to discuss the mechanics. And you'll have to put the whole thing together later in your mind to see how it all fits together when we start to do some of the projects or discuss it further in class. Now, there's one other thing that I want you to reflect on. I'd like you to compare, I'll just line them up here. I'd like you to compare attribute access on line 13 to attribute access on line 14. And you take a look at that while I run this and make sure it's there. Okay. Now, if you look closely at line 13 and line 14, I think you're going to see that the attribute access that we're doing has the exact same syntax, whether it's an instance attribute or a class attribute. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. And if you need to watch these videos a bunch of times to see how it all works and to reinforce in your mind how it all works, that could be helpful. It is difficult to show you exactly how we use all these things using small examples. And it may be some time before you really see the whole picture in terms of why we want to do this, in order to really disambiguate what we're doing and kind of see clearly what it is we're doing and how. But take a look at these two instance accesses, the access of the instance attribute and then the access of the class attribute. They're both using the syntax object.attribute. And that's significant because you can see that we're getting the values from two different places. Where does person name exist? Where was it set? Can you point to the line where we set person name? Where we set it, where we set the value person name. On line 7, right? On line 7, we assigned the attribute person name and we gave it the value David. Now, it's safe to say that when we set this attribute, we set it in the object, in the instance. We called this an instance attribute, and we said it was an attribute of the instance that gets set in the instance and can be retrieved through the instance. Now we're talking about class attributes, but we're seeing that it's possible to set a value in the class, mind you, and retrieve it from the instance. So how is it that we can set a value in two different places, a value in the instance and a value in the class, and yet they're both accessible through the instance? Why is that? The reason has to do with the underlying functionality of these objects and of object-oriented programming in general. And that is that we have something called an attribute lookup. And we can kind of summarize it very informally by saying that when we look up a value in the instance, when we look up an attribute from the instance, I should say, Python looks in two places. The first, the instance itself. The second, the class. If the instance can be found in the, if the attribute can be found in the instance, then Python finds it there and it retrieves it. If the attribute can be found not in the instance but in the class, then Python will find it there and will retrieve it. And when we call methods, we're not just calling methods. What we're doing first is we're looking up an attribute. We're looking up an attribute, and if we can't find it in the instance, Python will then go look for it in the class. And of course, greet, like cvar, is a variable defined in the class. So we find that methods and any other variables that we define in the class are what we call class attributes, and that when we want to retrieve those values, we can retrieve them from the class through the instance. Now I'd like to give you an example of us doing this, and I'd like to show you how the class variables are going to be common to all instances, and the instance variables are going to be particular to each instance. So I wonder if you could extrapolate from what we've discussed and tell me what I'm likely to see if I print x.personname, if I print y.personname, if I print x.cvar, and if I print y.cvar. And see if you can, maybe you want to pause this video, see if you can tell me what we're going to see when we print each of these values. Give it a shot and pause the video, and we'll discuss when you unpause. Okay, so what is the value of person name for x and y, and what is the value of cvar from x and y? Again, don't forget, we are, and I guess I should have left this, attribute lookup from an instance begins by searching the instance attributes, and then, if not found, searches in the class. Can't fit it all. So what is the value of x.personname? Well, we constructed x by passing a value up, and that value got assigned to init. Got passed to init, and we assigned it to person name in the instance. So the answer here is David. Y works in exactly the same way, except that when we initialized or constructed a myClass instance for Y, we gave it the value Georgina. However, cvar has been part of the class all along. It's part of the definition of the class. Again, when we look up an attribute in an instance, it looks in the instance itself, and if it can't find it there, it looks in the class. So, for both x and y, we will see 1000. This is just the basic mechanics of attribute lookup. Now, the meaning of class variables and why they're important, again, that's something that's going to come through, I think, a little later in your experience. Might not be that clear why we would do this, but you do want to comprehend the mechanics of it so that when we begin to use classes more and more, you may begin to see why we would have some class variables. Of course, methods themselves are class variables, and we need methods. So you can kind of see why we have this. When we say x.greet, for example, I got rid of greet for space. But when we said x.greet, it's not just that greet was a method. It really isn't. It's that It's that when we said x.greet, Python was going through the same attribute lookup as it did here. When we say object.attribute, if that object is a my class object or really any kind of object, the first place Python is going to look is in the instance attributes, as we see down here. And then after that, we'll look it up in the class and look for class variables. So it's maybe less clear why we would need something like cvar to have a common variable that's accessible to each of the class attributes. Each of the instances of the class. But it should be less confusing to see that when we say x.greet, Python needs to find greet somewhere. And the place it finds it is, it doesn't find it in the instance, but it does find it in the class. And so this is the meaning of a class variable. It's mostly for these methods, although there are many cases where we will want to have common variables that are accessible from multiple instances. This is the meaning of class variables and class attributes.